project is called difference-oriented urban planning. So how you can plan a city in a way that people that are different and represent different lifestyles, different logics of living, different abilities, can be considered in urban planning in a way that they are feeling to be part of the city. In this sense, the project is really nearly related to Richard Sennett's idea of the open city that you heard certainly from Linda.
Not yet. He was my professor, actually.
Yeah, I know. That's why I say
it. We are not at the Richard Sennett part yet.
Yeah. So Richard Sennett and Saskia Sassen together developed this idea of open city. Richard more with this claiming of what is open city in a very normative way, and Saskia Sassen more in an empirical way, but together it's the framework of what we think it's the future of cities. Cities that are not exclusive but inclusive of all kinds of people. That's the major idea. The problem is now the following. That's why we do research. There is no answer to this question, how to plan an open city. There's nobody had worked about that. And so we tried to make a project with an open end, and we don't know if we will have an answer to this question. Currently, what are cities doing? They are trying to work with the logic of planning a city and then correct what they have done for some groups. So typically you construct a city and then you say, oh, women feel not safe in the city, so we have to put lights there. Or you say, oh, we have constructed this building, but there is no space for disabled people that cannot walk, for instance, in this place. So we correct it, that they can enter. And our idea is, and I present it the first time today, to change the logic in a certain way. To change the logic of construction of the city, of building the city, of planning the city, taking the other point of view, the point of view of the fragile bodies, the point of view of the difficulties that many people have in the city. The city were planned historically only since more or less 100 years. Before there was construction in evolving places, and it was planned more step by step in a certain way. But then they introduced in many cities already in the 19th century logics of planning, and they were more and more professionalized until arrived a certain Le Corbusier, an architect, who told to the city planners and to the city builders that they have to have something like a reference figure to build and construct the city and to plan the city. And this reference figure was a man which has 1.83 m height, and who is the reference for making doors, for making public transports, for making all what the city is today. And this reference was called the modular. And modular, it's today always the main reference in city planning and city and building. And the problem of the modular is not really that it's a man, but the problem of the modular is that it's a healthy, strong man. It's a man that has no problems, who uses the city. And so the result of this city planning and city building with this modular reference was nothing else as the city of men. And so in the 80s, feminist groups coming from the US in particular, very strong feminist planners, said we have to change that. Cities are done for men and not for women. And this was the first really challenging intervention from these social movements regarding city development and the city as it is built today. We are trying to make a step forward. So the city of men that has to be corrected for all of the other groups, we want to change the logic and work on something like a new modular, which is no more the man, 1.83 m, 6 feet, that's why it's 1.83 m. It was first 1.78 m, but then Americans transformed it in 6 feet. But take as figure of reference the fragile person, the fragile body, the fragile situation. And the question is now, and I don't have a real good answer on that, how can we imagine this figure? How can we imagine this fragile person? What is it? And it's clear, if I take Judith Butler, that perhaps you know, who deconstructed the body of women, deconstructed homosexuality, deconstructed in a certain way all categories of existing discrimination, and put another concept forward, which was the suffering bodies, the suffering discriminated bodies. And she called in her last book something like a coalition of all these bodies, and not more to make fights for women, fights for homosexuals, fights for disabled people, fights for migrants, but fights for the discriminated bodies. But if I tell to an architect, take the discriminated body as reference to construct, he will not know what to do with them. So we have to make a step further and saying something like, what could be this discriminated body? And I'm very interested to know what do you think about this idea. But it's certainly a body which has mobility difficulties, that's clear. It's certainly a body that has perhaps cognitive difficulties, that's also clear. It's perhaps an old woman with mobility difficulties and with cognitive problems. And so that could be this new body. But if you construct a city for this body, there is place for all the others too. That is a little bit our idea. So if you change completely the logic, you will have this planning for an open city. The only problem, the old woman with cognitive and mobility problems, it's a nice person, certainly, but we need also to think about children. So they are really different children, but they have some elements in common. And I don't know if you can say, if you think about this old woman, you can have a city which is also open for children, for young children. And then begins another thinking of the decelerated city, of the slow city, of the city without cars, of the city with a circular economy, of the city of prototypes with industries inside clearly that are not polluting, and think like that. So you construct something like a new way of planning and building the city through the fragilized bodies. But perhaps, and it exists only one example in the whole world, is a park in Berlin. Perhaps thinking about these two bodies as reference could be something like a step forward. The old woman with disabilities and the child, 6-year-old. And in Hamburg, in Berlin, they planned a park with these two figures as references.
Where is this park?
I don't know where it is, but it's the only park that is planned in another logic. Because you plan parks for children, for instance, that clear playgrounds for children, but such places are used by many other people. So again, if you're thinking in an open way, it's an open place, an open space. The case we heard about was analyzed by our colleague Shannon Demery, and it's a very good example of this children playground. She worked with women in Brussels and in a park too, how to design this park that it could be a park also open for women. And we invited her to talk about this case in our clinic, in our class we have had together last year. And what was interesting about this history is the following. There were 3 Muslim young women, which scarf and all it goes together. And she asked them what they want as park. And they say, we want a playground there. Okay. Now the question is why they want a playground in this park. And the answer was from them, we don't have kids, we don't have children. But we know that in this playground, we are in a safe space. Alcoholics come not in, men are far away. They feel like a place for fragile children, and it's also a place for discriminated bodies like we are. Muslim women in Brussels. And this is a little bit the idea behind our project, how to arrive to something like that. But many problems go together, and that's why it's a very complex project. We work together with the ETH in Zurich and the EPFL in Lausanne, and have developed different approaches to the same question. The ETH in Zurich has tried, or is trying to do, and we heard yesterday that they have problems with this approach, but I think it's an approach that has a potential, has tried to do cognitive experiments with people and analyzing how they react emotionally to pictures of a place they know. What they do concretely, they have glasses in their head. It's a little bus that circulates in the city, and they give them glasses, and they see a known place near the car, this bus parking. And then they transform this known place, putting in more green, or more savage green, or beton. And then they see how the reactions are from an emotional point of view. And then arrives the problem. Young people, for instance, don't like green. They like grey. Playgrounds, which they can make parties, and they can make plenty other things. Old persons don't like children playgrounds. So it's not so easy thinking this figure of all and this figure for all persons. I think that this link between emotions and characteristics of the person is very important too for urban planning strategies. But I think also that we have to go more in a more complex logic of analysis. And that's what we are doing with the students here in social work in this moment. They observed places. And what a place has as a characteristic, it's not a static place. Places changes during the day. And you can imagine that the young boy or the young girl doesn't be in a public place Tuesday morning. So Tuesday morning, the rhythm of the place, it's more a rhythm for elderly people that can go there, sit there, talking together, or for very small children. So places can be inclusive, better inclusive of differences, if you think the temporality of the places.
Time, space.
Time and space. With Fiorenza, we are working on an article now which is called the neighborhood park. We distinguish clearly the idea of the urban park, which is a large space like we have it here, which is open but not really a place for all, but a place in which you invest. You use it when it's something going on, when you meet somebody. But the neighborhood parks, in contrary, they are appropriated by the people that lives around and that works near. And so we began these observations, and we have seen that they are really, the rhythms define the people that use the place. But you can think the place in a logic of the different rhythms the place have. And so you can think it's a place that you can make the birthday party in the end of the day. It's a place in which you can grill in the evening. It's a place in which you can hear music after 11 o'clock, for instance, if you have a concrete space for that, etc., etc. Children can play in the morning, and these are normally neighborhood parks which are not large. They are perhaps 40 on 40 meters or 50 on 50 meters. They have a little bit green, but they have also other spaces that you can play, for instance, ping pong, etc. So the rhythms are important. So these cognitive experiments, it's like opening a little door, but they will not bring out more than places are related to emotion. So we are a little bit critical about this work, but it has to be done. Otherwise, you cannot be critic. So it's always the same. The group in Lausanne, together with another group in Zurich, are working on mobility schemes. That's the second part of the project. It's a very classical approach they have. They have developed a survey, a representative survey, and it was already done in the majority of the city we are analyzing. And the survey is more about mobility schemes during a day and regarding different characteristics of groups. So how refugees use the city, for instance, in which place they are. And they want to find out if there are places for all, in which you find all groups. And these places will be places we want to analyze more, to see better what is going on in these places. But the problem of surveys, and I don't have to cite again Judith Butler because she's not alone. The problem of surveys is if you say women are like that and men are like that these categories are completely fictive. They are not real. They are categories which include too many differences. And that's Kimberly Crenshaw with the approach of intersectionality, who says that if you're black and woman, it's something else as if you're white and woman. And she worked on this kind of criticizing categories, and that's why for the project it's again important, because perhaps we have something like a place, but for the idea to develop something like the open city, it's more problematic. The third part of the project is the part that I'm doing in particular with Fiorenza and with Olivier. Two persons are the third group with me, and what we do there is something like a reconstruction of the history of urban planning. And we focalize on some specific places in each city. I forgot to say that we are in 6 cities, but only in 4 with the whole 20 researchers working in this project. These are Brussels, Turin, Hamburg, and Geneva. And Pristina, we do not only this third part, urban planning, and in a more superficial way, because we have taken Pristina and Montreal as mirror cases to verify hypotheses for our main project. And Pristina is the bad case, and Montreal is the good case. It's the city of differences, the city of Leonie Sandercook, and she worked on Toronto, Montreal, and on Australian cities, the city of differences, cosmopolitics. Cosmopolis is one of her books about this idea. So we went in Montreal, and now we will go, I think, only in 2024 to Montreal, but okay. Pristina, it's a bad case, but not really a bad case, and I will tell you then why I think that. But first, the third group of research. We go in archives, we search plans, and we try to make something like a history of planning oriented to the question of differences. And we find out in this history of plannings that the first time the idea of differences is introduced is in the 19th century at the end, and at the beginning of the 20th century through the socio-economic differences and social housing. So you have in these cities social housing developed from the 20s until the 70s. And social housing is again oriented on modular. So Le Corbusier was one of the main architects developing social housing. In Berlin there is a large place near to the Olympia Stadium built by Le Corbusier, and you see this.
We also have something in Pristina.
Ah, yeah? What?
The faculty of technical faculty.
Okay.
But we, of course, put some styropor around it to protect it for future generations. But yeah, no, it's the Corbusier student, not
Okay.
him, but it's the same model. Faculteti technique na breg.
Okay. So really, what is nice about this, it's that all these social housing projects, the first projects in planning oriented to differences in a city, are based on the modular, on this figure of a man. And they have constructed that in the logic of the functionalistic city. And all the planning is functionalistic until the 80s, more or less. So we have more or less 60 to 70 years of the functional city in which homogeneity is the orientation. Homogeneity and nothing else. In the plans you have, for instance, the family number, number that you can have in an apartment. And they planned really these buildings with the orientation 57 square meters for a family with 1 child and 67 square meters for a family with 2 children. And so the whole house is like that. And if you think you plan in a way to have the regular small family in the cities, and this is the future of our society, you have these housings today which are completely badly used. They are not efficient and not related to what families are today. More than the half of the families in Europe, in the EU Europe, more as the half of the families are divorced families. So they have 2, 3, 4 kids from 2, 3 different partners. That's the normal family in Europe today, and not the family which is always together. Oh, I want to kill your romantic view about families.
I'll do that next semester.
You do that next semester. But that means that this kind of housings are problematic because kids have to be 1 week in one family, 1 week in another, so you can have situations like a friend of mine in Brussels, with 6 kids in a weekend in an apartment. So it's engineering question for him to organize all the places for these kids. So homogeneity was the orientation, and we can really make a parallel between Pristina and all the other cities we are analyzing, because this functionalistic modernist planning was also here the main orientation, with many good ideas. But the idea is there are places in which you sleep, there are places in which you work, there are places in which there are parks or leisure activities. The city was called The Three Cities by Hartmut Häusermann in a very important book on written in the 80s, criticizing the fact that dysfunctional planning has killed the cities. Because you kill urbanity if you divide sleeping, leisure, and work. You create the chance to meet in other contexts, in other logics. The city has to be rethought in a way that it's open to all kinds of differences, and as often, or I would say as all the time, the main movements were feminist movements to change and to challenge the view of the city for men and city for homogeneity. And it's really nice because it's always this rhythm we have. First, women feminist groups criticizing what is going on, and then with the logic of thinking of the feminist groups, other groups began to say, oh, they forgot also us. And so we have a very strong disability movement coming in the 80s and 90s up in the cities, saying the cities are for able people or with specific abilities, but our abilities are not present. So, abilities. Then came the whole history about migration and migration, places of migration. First, it was even in the Chicago school a problem, ghettos. We have to go against ghettos. Then came the Simmelian, Simmelian was before, the Simmelian approach. Ghettos are places for people coming from outside and not understanding what the city is about, that city's freedom and it's not ghettoization. They reconstruct peasantry in the city. So really strong critiques against ghettos. And again, through research and through movements, these places were seen as places of entry in the city for many people. Only places of entry in the city, places of first help of newcomers in the city, places of low rents. You can pay that when you arrive. If you don't have a job immediately, you can begin there. So these ghettos are something like the ports of the city. The places in which you enter and which you find your place in a second time if you want. So the difference between the ghettos, the new ghettos and the old ghettos, it's simply that they are open. And the main thing cities have to do is not to close them, to let the possibility to go to these places, to find a first place in the city you arrive, but also to keep it open, not to close it like the Jewish ghettos. People has to have the chance to go out, but also to keep their place there, clearly. And so we have a very interesting case in Hamburg we are analyzing. It's a neighborhood called Veddel, which was social housing of the 40s and 50s, so end of the 40s and 50s, and they were built for the Turkish migration. And so it's a Turkish neighborhood, completely isolated between streets and railway and water. So you cannot really, you have to go there if you want to go there, so you pass not through. It's isolated. And now we have transformed this part of the city with a very ambitious creation of a new city. And now the question is how you handle this neighborhood Veddel. Do you gentrify that or not? It's a concept we heard only in Hamburg, gentrification from bottom up gentrification. No, top down gentrification. Very strange concept. So the municipality says we have to gentrify this bad neighborhood. because that's good for the neighborhood. Imagine, no? It's already so easy to gentrify places if the politics tries to do that also. So they are now organizing themselves in a logic, save the fiddle. So save our space, save our sociability, save our friendships, save our trustful environment. And that's interesting. If you begin to think about trustful environment, you think to understand ghettos of migrants, China's neighborhood, Italian neighborhood, and all this kind of stuff. But you understand also why in Pristina, near to the city center, it's the beginning of the creation of an LGBT neighborhood near the bubble. They told us at the bubble that more and more people want to live there, which have different sexual orientation as the mainstream. And what does it mean? They go to these places because they know that there are many, they have similar experiences of discrimination, and they feel trust them more than in other neighborhoods. So these are places in a certain way in which this figure of the discriminated woman, etc., is the reference. And so it is for many of these migrant neighborhoods. These are neighborhoods of people that are at high risk of discrimination, at high risk to be excluded from the society. So we introduced this idea we have seen this idea of thinking groups in the 80s as coming up in many cities related to social movements again. First women and critique to the male city, then disability and disability movements, then many related to migration, refugees, solidarity questions, etc. But in fact, all what we see is that cities that have money and they want to be open to these groups invest in this repairing logic. That's what in this moment is the result of the research we are doing. There are many social movements here that are trying to transform the city from bottom up, but I will arrive to them immediately. Concerning the planning, so the history is very easy. We have more neighborhood-oriented regulatory plans, so it's not planned as a whole city, except in the 70s with this new plan in which you think about mobility, about spaces for all, etc. Then arrives this dramatic civil war in Yugoslavia, and with all the dramatic consequences, but it's perhaps bad to say, but also with some good experiences. In a certain way, Pristina was taken in their hands by many women to organize everyday life, to organize alternative schooling, to organize alternative universities, Albanian teaching, and I think we talked about that already. It's a very important, and men were in war. They are killing other men. And what is interesting, these killing men are in the whole city as the heroes, but the women that realized and the survival of the city, they are not really seen. They are seen as victims of rape, but not seen as the managers of the city during many years. So what is interesting of this Pristina very specificity, it's that today many movements are driven by women. These are daughters of these strong women of the 80s, of the 90s, that told to their daughters, you can do things, you can be an actor, you have agency. And so we have this very strange ambivalence in this country and in Pristina between a very patriarchal and military organized view of the society on the one side, and on the other side, this enormous number of activists and groups in many working on many topics, disability, feminism in particular, but also peace creating, education through theater, and all this kind of stuff, which are driven by women, largely driven by women. The Americans, already in the 70s, criticized this growth machine. It's a term that was developed by a sociologist called Moloch. And Moloch has written, cities in the hands of interest groups are bad cities, are cities that are lost for all that they cannot be reconstructed. And what they have done here, 30 years later, nothing. They realized the growth machine. Completely driven by economic interest, the city developed in a very chaotic way, in a very anarchical way, in a very not regulated way, without master plans for the orientation, without regulatory plans that are larger than small housing projects. So even neighborhood regulation was eliminated largely. And now the problem is, okay, how to return to plan this city, how to return to give to this city something like a sense. And that's what we have tried to find out, and the answers we received came from these activists. They have good ideas, but in this moment, the interplay with politicians, it's very complicated. Because first of all, to regain something like the capacity to act on a city, you have to regain the access to the ownership.
Exactly.
And
that's the key.
That's the key point. And we can talk a little bit about Berlin and a little bit about Hamburg if you want.
You maybe just give the case of Berlin on this sort of fight for ownership in Berlin. I think it's very interesting. Berlin and Barcelona has always been interesting for me.
Yeah. These are good cases because social movements decided in this fight for the city that the ownership has to return to cities. And so they promoted now in many cities in the north, first of all, cooperative schemes for housing, which is non-profit oriented buildings and housing. And this non-profit logic was in a certain sense in the legal framework integrated in a logic of cooperative firsts. So if something can be sold, the first that can buy it are cooperatives. Second thing they have done, again through a fight, social movements related to politics, that the ownership of all territories has to be, and more by the city. In the law that means that the city can buy all the territories first, and not to put it in a market, no more. The question of the ownership is the fundamental question to plan another city, to plan a city which is more open. So Berlin introduced also the 30% clause, which means that if you construct privately a house, 30% of the house has to be social housing. So you can add many elements like that. Disability, for instance, 5% of the apartment has to be for disabled people. And the last thing they have done in Berlin is to, with a law, again coming from social movements, to take the property through a law to all investors that have more than 1,000 apartments. It's a large number, 1,000 apartments. But if you have more than 1,000 apartments, the city is now obliged to take the property of them, to disappropriate them. In Hamburg they are discussing 300 apartments. So you have no more large investors. They will no more kill the city like they have done it before. Because if you see these investors and how they act, it's really the classical logic of speculation. We buy, we construct, and then we give it to the global elite that lives a little bit in Berlin, a little bit in New York, a little bit in Rome. And so this logic, to change that, means many things. Means that the city returns in the hands of the public. The city returns in the hand of the democracy. Okay. Now, returning to Pristina. It's okay for the case. Returning to Pristina, we have this problem now to repair many things. Because the city is really not a city for disabled people. It's not a city for migrants. It's not a city for Roma people. So many things.
Not a city for women.
Not a city for women at all. So it's a very dangerous city. And so the question is how you do it otherwise. And I think you have to go through the ownership question first. What we have seen here in Pristina is that even the plan that it's now be developed, the new urban plan of Pristina, it will be presented next year, is written and realized by a private company. So it's not the city who is writing the future of Pristina. It's not democracy who is writing the city of Pristina of tomorrow, but a private group of planners. They could do good work, certainly, and they can be asked to make participation. But all these elements, which are something like creating a democratic development of the city, are not so efficient from the point of view of interest and money you can take on that. So they will keep it very small and do it as quick as possible. What is the plan for the investors? And so we are here in a real important problematic of thinking the city of tomorrow, and then arrives all these groups. And we analyzed how they work, and it's something between legal and illegal. It's always a little bit in between. They take spaces in general, spaces in the city, they invest them, and then they create something like a de facto situation for the municipality and say, okay, if you want to shut us out, you will have problems, because we have already done so many in this neighborhood, in this space we have occupied. We have already so many invested in the neighborhood to create better living conditions. And there are such groups like Thermokis, Foundation 17, and many others that are doing what we call tactical urbanism, creating something like a new reality and then confronting, if this reality is good working, the political actors with these new facts. And what they do until now, they accept that. And that's also very strange for me, but it explains that on the side of the municipality you have not resources in this moment to intervene, even if such groups are doing something. So in a certain way, I would say that Pristina is besaved as good as possible by these legal-illegal groups that appropriate spaces for them, that repair spaces for them, that invest with sense spaces. Neighborhood meeting points, for instance, are typically results of such kind of investments, but also cultural event places are typically result of such investments. That's not the best we can do, but it's interesting for us arriving from Hamburg, in which all participation is instrumentalized, thought in a certain way before, even before constructing and thinking. They go to the people to ask what they want. So all the creativity that comes from this investment through bottom-up initiatives are very rare in Hamburg, and very rare also the logics of tolerate such spaces. So they say we have all the instruments, you don't need to occupy a place. No, they are in a certain way on the other side, and something in between would be better. That's clearly the case. But here you can learn what arrives if people take the city in their hands, and arrives nice things. Clearly, you cannot, through such kind of initiatives, intervene in what is the mobility scheme of Pristina of tomorrow. You cannot plan it from bottom up. But you can certainly learn from these bottom-up initiatives that if you reinforce participation, the results are accepted, more accepted certainly, but also better, because people knows how they use public transports. Disabled people knows how is going well and not well in the city for them.
But even you couldn't meet our mayor, so...
And they're all shocked that I don't have meet him. Yeah.
Busy man.
So in a certain way, the second element I would like to stress in this conference is, beside the ownership, the question of participation. And if you combine these two things, I think even if the situation is so anarchically destroyed like it is in Pristina, you can begin by piece to improve the city. A city is always living, it's never finished. It's a continuous planning. That's something which we try also to say all the time when we interview people. Don't think in these categories that I have a plan, I realize it, and then it's finished. But think the city as an infinite space, never finished. So participation is something you have to do every day, all the time. And you have to have instruments to be all the time near to the people with their needs and their capacities to invest in the city, more than to make this very top-down participation logics that we have, for instance, in Hamburg. I think Pristina have the basis for that, because it's all based on the social movements, what is going on now here. So there's a chance also for Pristina. Yes, this was my small discourse I wanted to present you.
Thank you so much.